What started as a heated debate turned into a complete meltdown. Greg Gutfeld's unfiltered response was just too much for her to handle. The studio lights gleamed overhead, casting a sharp glow on everything in sight. The air was thick with a kind of unspoken energy, one that was almost tangible, crisp, electric, and crackling with anticipation. It wasn't just another night of late-night TV. Something in the atmosphere made it feel like it could be one of those rare moments when the debate would cross into new territory, a moment that would leave a lasting impact. Greg Gutfeld, as always, was at the center of it all. Seated comfortably behind the desk, his familiar smirk hid just how much he relished the tension in the air. He had spent years perfecting his ability to challenge anyone, liberal or conservative, with a cool, calm demeanor and a razor-sharp tongue. He knew the value of timing, how to land a blow when it would matter most, and how to keep the audience hanging on his every word. Across from him sat Rachel, a prominent liberal host who had made a name for herself with her fiery opinions and ability to take on the toughest subjects head-on. Tonight, however, something was different. The usual fire she carried in her eyes seemed dimmer. She shifted in her seat, eyes flicking nervously toward the teleprompter as though she were trying to anchor herself to something solid, anything to stop her rising discomfort. Her every move was calculated. But beneath it all, Greg could sense the edge of vulnerability, something rare, but not entirely invisible. She had no idea what was coming. Greg took in the scene with an almost imperceptible smile. The set was polished, the cameras were perfectly aligned, and the audience was silent, waiting. In that silence, you could feel the unspoken tension between the two of them. Greg could see the audience shift in their seats, eager for what was about to unfold. He had a reputation for challenging his guests, often throwing curveballs that made even the most prepared hosts flounder. But tonight felt different. Something in Rachel's eyes told him she might not be prepared for what he had planned. "Tonight's show," Greg said, leaning forward just slightly, his voice smooth and steady, "is going to be a conversation you don't want to miss. We'll be tackling everything from political correctness to the state of our current leadership, and we'll see where it all takes us. But first, let me ask you this, Rachel." Rachel straightened up at the mention of her name. Her lips parted, her posture stiffened. She was ready to play her part, ready to deliver her own brand of sharp words, thinking she could take on whatever Greg threw her way. But Greg, as always, had something else in mind. He continued with a calm yet pointed question that struck directly at the heart of one of her pet causes. It wasn't an attack, not yet, but it was a subtle jab, a challenge that set the tone for what was to come. The audience leaned in. The energy was growing. "Here's the question," Greg said, his eyes never leaving Rachel's. "Do we really believe that silencing people with differing opinions is the answer to bringing about change? Or does it just silence progress?" Rachel's expression faltered for just a fraction of a second. For the first time in the evening, her composure slipped, ever so slightly. She knew this was going to be one of those moments, a live broadcast where every word mattered. She tried to push back, tried to regain her balance, but it was already too late. Greg's question had landed, and it was about to set the stage for everything that followed. But the tension in the room only thickened, and the countdown to the debate's turning point had begun. The air in the studio had changed. What started as an ordinary conversation was quickly turning into something much more charged. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she straightened her back, adjusting her posture like a fighter preparing to land the first punch. She wasn't about to let Greg get the upper hand. At least, that's what she told herself. "You're twisting my words, Greg," she snapped, her voice sharp, filled with the fire that had made her a prominent figure in the media. "What we need is a system that listens to people who have been silenced for far too long. It's not about shutting people down. It's about creating space for voices that matter." Greg listened, his expression unwavering. He had heard this before, time and time again, in various forms, from various people. The rhetoric, the framing of the debate, it was all too familiar. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, Rachel was on the defensive, and Greg knew it. He could see the cracks in her carefully constructed argument. She was trying to hold her ground, but the tension between them was growing, and it was becoming more obvious to the viewers with every passing second. Greg leaned in slightly, never losing that calm, collected demeanor. "You say it's not about silencing people," he said, almost in a whisper, as if to make sure the viewers were paying attention. "But what happens when those voices you want to protect start dictating what others can or cannot say? Doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of free speech?" Rachel's face flushed, the color rising in her cheeks as Greg's words hit their mark. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening. The audience was still, each person holding their breath, waiting for Rachel to recover. Her hand gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white from the pressure. She was trying to regain control, trying to find her footing again, but Greg had already planted the seed of doubt. He knew the debate wasn't just about words. It was about power, influence, and the subtle art of using language to control a conversation. "I'm not twisting anything, Greg," Rachel finally managed, her voice a little louder now, a little more forceful. "You're just not listening. You're so focused on trying to prove a point that you're missing the bigger picture." But Greg wasn't distracted. He had heard the same arguments countless times, and he was ready to counter her, point by point. His smile, that ever-present smirk of his, remained. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't even fazed. Rachel, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of wear. She was in uncharted territory, and Greg knew exactly how to navigate these waters. "Maybe I'm not listening to your version of the bigger picture, Rachel," Greg replied, his voice steady and calm. "But that's the beauty of this country, right? We all get to have a voice. We all get to disagree, even when we don't like what the other person has to say." Rachel's gaze hardened, but she knew she was losing ground. She could feel the control slipping through her fingers. Every word she spoke seemed to make things worse. Every defense she tried to mount only exposed her vulnerabilities more clearly. And Greg? He was enjoying every moment of it. But with each word, the temperature in the room kept rising. The stage was set for what would come next, and neither of them knew just how far it would go. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Rachel inhaled sharply, her composure hanging by a thread. The usual fire in her arguments wasn't landing the way it normally did. Her words, which had once commanded rooms, were losing weight, slipping through the cracks like sand in an hourglass. And Greg knew it. The cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of emotion on her face. The audience wasn't just watching a debate. They were witnessing a shift in power. Rachel adjusted her posture, leaned forward, and tried to reclaim the ground she was rapidly losing. "So, what you're saying, Greg, is that everyone should have an equal say, no matter how harmful their words might be? That people with platforms should be able to spread misinformation and face no consequences?" Greg didn't hesitate, not for a second. His response was precise, surgical. "No, Rachel. What I'm saying is that your definition of harmful changes depending on who's speaking, and that's the problem." Rachel flinched. Just a little, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Greg let the words settle. He knew the weight they carried. He knew what they meant. He wasn't just talking to Rachel, he was talking to everyone watching. "See, the real issue here," he continued, leaning back casually in his chair, "is that people like you want to control the conversation, but you disguise it as progress. If someone says something you don't like, suddenly it's misinformation. But when your side gets it wrong, when it's your narrative that falls apart, somehow the rules change. You get to rewrite the definitions. You get to move the goalposts. And the second someone calls it out, you play the victim." The room went still. Rachel's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Greg tilted his head slightly, his expression one of mild amusement. And that's the real double standard, isn't it? The air felt heavier. The audience shifted, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Rachel swallowed, her jaw tightening as she struggled to find a counterpoint. She opened her mouth, paused, then closed it again. For the first time in the entire debate, she had nothing. Greg let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to realize what had just happened. Then, with perfect timing, he delivered the final blow. "If free speech only works when you agree with it, Rachel, then it's not free speech. It's control." The reaction was immediate. A low murmur swept through the audience. The weight of those words settled in, undeniable, irrefutable. Greg had just flipped the entire conversation on its head. Rachel shifted in her chair, her fingers twitching against the table. Her confidence, once unshakable, was cracking in real time. She knew she had to say something, anything, to regain control of the moment. But she also knew that anything she said now would feel like an afterthought. Greg had already won this round. But the real unraveling was only just beginning. The pressure was mounting, and Rachel was about to hit her breaking point. The studio had never been this quiet. No forced laughter, no scripted back and forth, no safe return to neutral ground. Just silence. Heavy, deafening silence. Rachel's face, once controlled and confident, now told a different story. She was staring at Greg, her breathing slightly uneven, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Greg didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His expression remained neutral, but his posture spoke volumes, relaxed, at ease, completely unfazed by the unraveling happening right in front of him. He had done this before. He had seen it play out 100 times. But this was different. Rachel tried to recover. So what, Greg? You think that just because you can frame the argument a certain way, you're automatically right? That if you throw enough buzzwords at me, you win? Her voice wavered. The confidence she was desperately trying to project wasn't landing. She was scrambling, reaching for control that had already slipped through her fingers. Greg exhaled, almost as if he felt sorry for her. It's not about buzzwords, Rachel. It's about facts. You came in here expecting to have control of this conversation. You thought you could label opinions you don't like as misinformation and shut the door on anyone who disagrees. But the second someone calls that out, you don't have an answer. Rachel blinked rapidly, frustration and disbelief mixing on her face. That's not true, she shot back. But the energy behind it wasn't there. It sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. Greg just gave a small knowing nod. He didn't have to say anything. The silence said it for him. Then Rachel did something unexpected. She reached for her water, her fingers trembling just enough for the camera to catch it. She took a sip, buying herself time. But there was no time left. The audience could feel it. The entire studio could feel it. The unraveling was happening in real time. She exhaled sharply, setting the glass back down. You know what, Greg? She said, her voice tight, her frustration spilling over. This is exactly why people can't take you seriously. You sit here, smug, acting like you figured everything out, when in reality, you just spin things to fit your own bias. Greg raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. Rachel, if you're so sure I'm wrong, then why are you getting so worked up? Rachel froze. It was a simple question, but it was a dagger. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing every micro-expression, every flicker of emotion that betrayed the truth. She wasn't just losing this debate. She had already lost it. Greg leaned back in his chair, effortlessly composed. See, that's the thing, he continued, his tone almost conversational. When someone's really confident in their argument, they don't need to shout. They don't need to get angry. They don't need to panic. He gestured subtly in her direction. But when they do, well, that usually tells you everything you need to know. The audience reacted instantly, a low murmur, a few suppressed chuckles. The moment was crystal clear to everyone watching. Rachel's face hardened, her hands gripping the desk. Her breathing was shallow now, her jaw tight. She wasn't in control anymore. And worst of all, she knew it. But the more she tried to hold it together, the more everything was about to spiral out of her control. Rachel's mask was slipping, and everyone could see it. The audience, the crew, the viewers at home. She was fighting to hold on to the reins, but they had already been yanked from her hands. Greg remained motionless, watching, waiting. He had been in debates like this before, but this was something else. Rachel wasn't just losing an argument, she was unraveling under the pressure of a live broadcast, where there were no retakes, no edits, no chance to spin the narrative afterward. Her fingers drummed against the desk. A nervous tick. You know, Greg, she said, forcing a half smile. "I almost admire the way you deflect. You avoid engaging with real issues by turning every debate into some grand performance. It's not about facts for you. It's about winning." Greg's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. "Winning? Rachel, you're the one who came in here trying to control the conversation. I'm just refusing to play by your rules." Rachel inhaled sharply. Her frustration was starting to boil over, and she couldn't hide it anymore. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. She wasn't used to someone standing their ground this firmly, this effortlessly. The audience could sense it. The camera operators were locked in, capturing every detail. Her tightened grip on her pen, the subtle twitch in her jaw, the way she kept shifting in her seat as though she wanted to get up and walk away. Then came the breaking point. Rachel suddenly leaned forward, her voice rising. "Oh, please. You sit there acting like you're the voice of reason, but in reality you're just pushing the same tired arguments, the same nonsense that's been debunked over and over again. And yet here you are, playing the victim, acting like—" Greg raised a hand, just slightly, just enough to stop her mid-sentence. Rachel froze, and in that second, just a single fleeting second, she knew she had made a mistake. Greg lowered his hand slowly, his expression calm, measured. "Rachel," he said, his voice so controlled it almost sounded amused. "If I'm playing the victim, then what are you doing right now?" Rachel blinked. The audience let out a few scattered chuckles. Greg didn't let the moment pass. "Because, from where I'm sitting," he continued, "you're the one getting emotional. You're the one raising your voice. You're the one throwing accusations because you don't like where this conversation is going." Rachel sat back, crossing her arms tightly. She was visibly struggling to keep her composure. The cameras caught everything, the subtle tremor in her fingers, the rapid blinking, the way her lips pressed together as if she was forcing herself not to say what she really wanted to say. Greg exhaled, giving her a brief moment to respond. But she didn't. She couldn't. He tilted his head. "Nothing to say?" Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched. The longer it went on, the worse it became for her. Finally, she exhaled sharply and glanced off camera, as if looking for a producer to save her. But there was no saving her from this. Not now. Greg had taken control of the conversation, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But what happened after the cameras stopped rolling would be even more shocking than what had just unfolded. The show cut to a commercial break, but the tension in the studio didn't go anywhere. The air was thick with something unspoken, something raw. Rachel ripped off her earpiece, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked like she might break a tooth. The control she prided herself on had slipped right through her fingers, and she knew it. Greg leaned back in his chair, stretching like a man who had just finished a particularly easy workout. He wasn't gloating, at least, not openly, but the smirk on his face said everything. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had played the game better, faster, sharper. Rachel, on the other hand, was shaking. Not physically, but anyone watching closely could see it. The way her hands gripped the edge of the desk. The way she refused to make eye contact with anyone. The frustration, the embarrassment. It was all right there, simmering just beneath the surface. A producer rushed over, whispering something to her, probably telling her to shake it off, to pull herself together before they went back on air. But Rachel didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, unblinking, her mind racing. Then she did something that caught everyone off guard. She stood up. Greg glanced up at her, raising an eyebrow. "We still have another segment," he said, his voice light, almost amused. Rachel didn't respond. She just grabbed her notes, shoved them into her bag, and started walking. The audience, murmuring in low voices, watched as she stormed off the set. A production assistant hesitated, then hurried after her. "Rachel, we're back in 2 minutes. You need to—" Rachel spun around so fast that the assistant nearly ran into her. "I'm done," she snapped. "I'm not going back out there to be humiliated again." Greg exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. He had seen people storm off before, but this was something different. This wasn't just a bad night for Rachel, this was a total collapse. The assistant, clearly panicking, looked back toward the stage where the producers were scrambling to figure out what to do. The live countdown was still ticking, and their co-host was gone. Rachel didn't care. She kept walking, through the backstage doors, out into the hallway, and then gone. Back in the studio, Greg tapped his fingers against the desk, waiting. A makeup artist approached, dabbing at the side of his face, but he barely noticed. His eyes were still on the empty chair across from him. A few seconds later, the producer's voice came through his earpiece. "Greg, she's not coming back." Greg exhaled, shaking his head with a small chuckle. "Well," he muttered to himself, "that's a first." The commercial break was almost over. The cameras would soon be back on him. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The internet would eat this up. The clips would spread like wildfire. The headlines would write themselves. But instead of triumph, there was something else in Greg's expression. A flicker of something thoughtful, maybe even a little disappointed. Because at the end of the day, he wasn't looking for a victory lap. He was looking for a debate, and Rachel had just walked away from it. But as the world reacted to what had just unfolded, the conversation was far from over. The clip hit the internet before the credits even rolled. By the time Greg left the studio that night, the footage had already spread like wildfire. Social media was on fire. Memes, reaction videos, analysis from every angle. The headlines were brutal. "Greg Gutfeld shuts down liberal host. Watch her meltdown." "Rachel can't take the heat. Storms off live." "Gutfeld exposes the double standard on free speech. Liberal host loses it." The reactions were split, as always. Greg's supporters were cheering, calling it a masterclass in debate. Rachel's defenders were scrambling to reframe the moment, claiming she had been set up, ambushed, unfairly targeted. The networks? They were milking every second of the controversy. But Greg was just watching. He sat back in his office, scrolling through the reactions, reading the comments, absorbing the fallout. And despite the noise, despite the victory being handed to him on a silver platter, something about the whole thing felt off. Because this wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a spectacle. It wasn't about challenging ideas. It had turned into entertainment. Rachel hadn't just lost an argument. She had lost her composure, her credibility, and maybe even her career. And that wasn't the win Greg had been looking for. He had wanted a battle of wits, a real clash of ideas. But what he got was something else entirely. A moment where someone cracked under the pressure of their own contradictions. And that wasn't satisfying. As he leaned back in his chair, he thought about something his father used to say. "You don't win by making someone else lose. You win by proving why you were right in the first place." Greg wasn't sure that had happened here. Yes, he had been sharper. Yes, he had been quicker, calmer, more in control. But had the audience really learned anything? Or had they just watched someone unravel in real time? That was the real question. And it was a question no viral clip, no headline, no trending hashtag could answer. The next morning, Rachel issued a statement. It was short, clipped, careful. "I regret walking off the set, but I stand by my views. Sometimes conversations aren't worth continuing." Greg read it twice, then once more, and for the first time since the debate, he let out a real laugh. Because whether she realized it or not, that was the most honest thing she had said all night. And in the end, maybe that was the real lesson. When the conversation gets tough, you either stand your ground or walk away. But if you walk away, don't pretend you won. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking discussions.